In this video, I'll be reviewing the Moonman T2, which I purchased on Etsy for $26. That also included shipping. It came in this pretty wild box, and inside was a navy cardboard box with Moonman, and then the pen with some bubble wrap. The box was silly because it doesn't fit. Here I am trying to put it back in and it's not going to fit. It comes in brown, which is this copper color, or silver, and it's described as an elastic piston fountain pen made of aluminum alloy and acrylic. The nib sizes come in EF, F, medium, and something called bent nib, which I'm assuming is a Fude nib. This one is an F nib. It's the only one produced in-house. The other nibs they outsource. I had someone point out to me that this looks exactly like the Stipula Toccoferro in tobacco without the copper nib. The first thing I noticed is as I was trying to unscrew the cap that you inadvertently unscrew part of the barrel, so you have to hold up next to the cap to unscrew the cap. It's 2 full rotations to get the cap off. I don't use a clip, but the clip seems pretty tight, and it has Moonman written around the acrylic base. The cap seems fairly hefty, and I looked inside with a flashlight and I can't seem to see an inner sleeve. And speaking of the cap, the shape seems odd. It's like it kind of bows out and then comes back in, which kind of gives the pen a kind of chunky, stubby look. It has a metal section and the standard fine Moonman nib. Some say that a metal section weighs down the front end for a better writing experience. But if you post this pen, it doesn't post very securely, and it is super back heavy if you do. For instance, if you post this 3776, the writing feeling is totally different. Let's see why it's called an elastic piston fountain pen. When I first tried to push down on the spring, it was really stiff, so I thought it was like the Pen BBS 500. On the Pen BBS 500, you have to pull out the piston knob and turn it to engage it before you push it in. So on the Moonman T2, I started turning the knob, and then it fell off and then off the table, and then I thought my dog ate it. On that day, I was quicker than her, so I still had a functioning pen I could review today. I tried, but it doesn't appear that the section is removable. However, you can unscrew the little knob, take the spring off, and unscrew that collar, that whole section there, off the barrel. And then push the piston through the opposite end of that collar. And that way you can put silicone on your piston or clean out the rest of the barrel. Here it is completely disassembled except for the nib, or as disassembled as I can get it. Okay, and then we'll put it back together by putting the piston back into the collar and then screwing the collar back onto the barrel. It helps if you push the piston in just a little bit before you continue screwing it back on. Add the spring and then kind of pull down on it a little bit before you screw the knob back on. And then of course screwing on the rest of the barrel. The nib is friction fit and pulls straight out of the section. When putting the nib back in, keep in mind that the section has a little flat part in the opening. You can see it there on the bottom part. And the feed has a corresponding flat spot there on the bottom side. Let's put the nib back in and do a few comparisons. It's about the same height capped as a 3776, but it's girthier and a little bit heavier. It's a little longer uncapped, and the nibs are about the same size. It's a little bit shorter than a 149 capped, Toward the opening of the cap, it's about as girthy as a 149, but not so much as you get toward the top of the cap. That's due to the kind of funky design where it gets bigger in the middle. Uncapped, the 149 is longer, mainly because of the larger nib, and both the barrel and the section on the 149 is a little more girthier. I'm going to ink it up, but first I'm going to undo that collar so I can dry out the barrel. I usually run my new pens through some pen flush and then rinse it out. And here it's so easy to undo that collar, I can dry out the barrel also. If you're not going to mess with the piston, you can just unscrew the collar and not take off the rest of the stuff. First I'm going to ink it up with some Madozen Athena Ink Nihonbashi Ginkan. This is one of the limited inks that Madozen had for sale during their pen fair. I'll be doing a video on that later. This is one of those inks that are kind of light and thin and has a lot of chromo shading. It's a pretty well behaved ink with a normal flow. You can just stick the section in there and push on that spring, but I like to press it ahead of time and then stick the section into the ink. That cuts down on all the bubbling. After you release the knob, leave the section inside the ink for just a little bit longer. It takes a little while for the ink to fill up. Okay, we'll clean up our mess and see how it writes. The chromo shading didn't show up real well on this fine nib, but here's the tissue. And I also got some really good chromo shading on my finger. The pen was a smooth writer. I wanted to see how it wrote with this lighter ink, and then I'll try again with one more ink. The difference between this metal section and the metal section on other pens I have is that it's a pretty long section. So there's a lot of slippery metal there. But as I said, it's a smooth writer and it keeps up with me when I'm like scribbling around. And I've cleaned out the pen, and next up is Kakimori's Classic Theater. All of Kakimori's inks are now pigment based. They are water resistant, but they're not so pigmented as to be very thick. Here's Kala's Salute to Neon called Dude, and you can see that it's a really thick pigmented ink compared to Kakimori. So we'll ink it up and see how the T2 handles a pigmented ink. And I've got some trouble sticking that big section into the opening of this ink, so I kind of have to tilt it sideways to be able to ink it up. And again, give it a second or so after you release the knob for the barrel to completely fill up. And again, the T2 writes smoothly with no problems, hiccups, burps, or anything else. And it keeps up with my fast scribbling. As an aside, that Kakimori Classic Theater ink is indeed waterproof. And now I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent. It bothers me that the Moonman T2 so closely copies the Stipula Toccoferro. If you copy other people's stuff, then you're just a second-rate company that copies stuff. And the Moonman T2 writes well. The feed works fine, the nib works fine, the filling system works well. All they're really copying is the window dressing, and that's not the hard part. They basically just copied the cosmetics. Here's the Moonman C1. It's really cool. I don't even bother with the converter. I love filling it with ink with that chopped off lucite looking end. It's a cool pen. Moonman makes decent pens at a really good price. They're also capable of making really cool looking pens. I think they're totally capable of making really good pens that are really cool looking and not be copying someone else. As a result, I'll be keeping my C1, but probably not the T2. Let me hear your ideas on this in the comments. Next week, magnets.